Joni Ernst. I grew up castrating hogs on an Iowa farm. So when I get to Washington, I'll know how to cut pork.
Joni Ernst, mother, soldier, conservative.
That is by far the most successful ad of the 2014 campaign cycle, and it is a really good ad. It has catapulted formerly obscure Republican Senate candidate Joni Ernst into real contention in Iowa. The problem, though, with making a big splash in an ad is that people then pay attention when you have to go unscripted. And it turns out the kind of candidate who boasts about pig castration might also be the kind of candidate who tells people there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
We don't know that there were weapons on the ground when we went in. However, I do have reason to believe that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
What is that reason? What makes you...
I will tell you, my husband served in Saudi Arabia as the Army Central Command Sergeant Major for a year. And that's a hot button topic in that area.
That is true. That is a hot button topic in that area. Joni Ernst, or her campaign, recognized that she stepped in it because she subsequently released a statement claiming that despite what you just saw in that video in context, what she really was trying to say was that Iraq had once had WMD sometime in the past. Now, that awkward attempt to move on is at least an implicit acknowledgement there can be disqualifying claims in American politics, a lesson learned by President Obama's then green job czar, Van Jones, way back in 2009.
So on top of all of the radical, progressive, and communist nonsense coming from Obama's green job czar, Van Jones, you can now add, thinks the Bush administration blew up the World Trade Centers and covered it up.
That is beyond extremism and radicalism. That's psychotic paranoia. It's a malignant kind of politics.
The claims that this guy's making, that he would sign this kind of a letter, it is crazy that he still has a job.
Okay, now Van Jones says he never actually signed the 9/11 truther petition that prompted that spout of outrage, and he maintained from the start it did not reflect his actual views. But just that tiny little brush with trutherism was enough to get the guy drummed out of the White House. And all this got me thinking about what exactly should constitute a disqualifier when it comes to those who want to hold public office or even work inside the government. Joining me now, Bob Herbert, Distinguished Senior Fellow with Demos, Christina Bellantoni, Editor-in-Chief of Roll Call, and Richard Kim, Executive Editor of TheNation.com. I am really interested in the boundaries of taboo and consensus, and what are the kinds of things that are the kinds of things that politicians can argue about and the kind of things that kind of place them off the table. And I thought it was interesting to see the Ernst campaign felt that that claim about WMD was an off-the-table kind of claim they had to then deny, which I found to be progress of a sort. Are there certain things you think, Bob, that should be in the kind of off-the-table category that aren't currently in the off-the-table category?
Sure. I would start with if you don't have support for a robust Voting Rights Act, for example. So if you're running for national office and you don't feel that qualified Americans ought to be guaranteed the right to vote, that should disqualify you.
Just like Voting Rights Act as a matter of Voting Rights Act or opposition to the Voting Rights Act isn't off the table.
Yeah.
But here's the thing that's tricky about that, right? Is that no one comes out. You're right. That is actually rhetorically where we are in American politics, insofar as no one will come out and be like, I don't like the Voting Rights Act, unless, you know, Supreme Court justices. But, right, I think, don't you agree that if no one would actually come out and say that?
What I'm saying is you don't have to come out and say it. I'm saying that you need to be forthright in your support of a robust Voting Rights Act, because you need to be forthright in your support of Americans' right to vote.
And Rand Paul has come pretty close.
With the Civil Rights Act, which is not the Voting Rights Act, but
and
that package of civil rights legislation.
And that infamous moment on Rachel's show, with the long, torturous, just train wreck of an interview, in which he basically said, I'm not that into the public accommodation part of the Civil Rights Act, that was him flirting with precisely the line of the disqualifying.
Well, except that is it actually disqualifying? I mean, these are things that your opponents would use against you in a lot of different cases. I mean, that's the example I was going to cite. But also think about what Mitt Romney said during the debates about self-deportation.
Right.
Or Rick Perry getting booed during the debates when talking about the DREAM Act and compassion for undocumented immigrants. Right?
That moment, the moment where he said, if you don't believe in this, you don't have a heart, ended up being disqualifying for Rick Perry in the Republican primary.
What's tricky, though, is, you know, it's disqualifying, but what if it's your candidate who comes out with a disqualifying disqualifying position or statement, for example. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember way back when Jimmy Carter talked about he had no problem with maintaining the ethnic purity of neighborhoods, you know, and that did not make Democrats run out and vote for
Did you say that phrase?
Ford. Ethnic purity, yeah.
He uttered the phrase ethnic purity?
Yeah, absolutely right.
And your point that this litmus test can be applied to Democrats too is a real one. Vivek Murthy, who's nominated for Surgeon General, you know, he supports an assault weapons ban, which many members of Congress support. He thinks guns are a public health issue, which they just undeniably are when you have a machine that can kill people. And his nomination is being held up for those beliefs.
And so this is the interesting thing. There is you actually have a much tighter constraint of views that are disqualifying if you're trying to get confirmed, if you're trying to be a judge or work in the White House, than if you're running for office. I mean, and in some ways, I wonder if, like, there's a mismatch, right? You can say any old thing and get elected in this country. And you cannot say any old thing.
In part because if you inflame things with rhetoric, you're going to have either side rallying for or against you. And then that sort of like builds it up, and it keeps everybody going.
Well,
you can still win these elections by doing things like this. And so it's really tiers. You should never be talking about a woman's sort of body. That's just generally should be off the table, not something you should be talking about.
But that's not true, right? Women's, I mean, you're saying specifically in the case of like the famous
Todd Aiken, Richard Murdoch, talking about legitimate rape or what happens, you know, when a woman has an abortion. But in general, that's something that's kind of off the table. This is decided law in this country. There are still pro-life, pro-choice debates, but that's off.
But wait a second. Decided law is a different thing than disqualifying, right? Because people, the gap between that is what's interesting. It's fine to say, I think Roe was wrongly decided, right? What ended up being disqualifying for Todd Aiken was making a preposterous factual claim about the female body, and that was just biologically wrong, but also was offensive.
And became disqualifying.
But aren't we glad we know that now, that was sort of ferreted out in the political process? Aren't we glad we know that Joni Ernst thinks they're WMDs?
Well, she doesn't. Her campaign says she thought they were WMDs.
But the thing is, like, this is why sort of the language of disqualification sort of disturbs me a little bit, because you could see kind of vetters, you know, eliminating all these candidates. And I'm really glad all those statements happen in public, and that we know that these people believe these things, and that massive numbers of Republicans support those beliefs.
And the things shift, because, like, so the example I like to use is actually in Virginia Democratic Party, right? You've got a big Democratic primary going on in Northern Virginia right now, and all those candidates want to say, well, look, this candidate didn't support gay rights 10 years ago, and this candidate didn't. Well, show me one who did, because in Virginia, the Democratic Party couldn't have that line.
And that is the most interesting thing about the line of disqualifying. It moves, and I think there's some movement on one of my own issues I'm very passionate about, from WMD to climate change denialism, more on what should be a disqualifier for political office next.
Let me get this straight. You do not think that human activity, the production of CO2, has caused warming to our planet?
I do not believe that human activity is causing these dramatic changes to our climate the way these scientists are portraying it.
What information, reports, studies, or otherwise are you relying on to inform and reach your conclusion that human activity is not to blame for climate change?
Well, again, I mean, headlines notwithstanding, I've never disputed that the climate is changing, and I pointed out that climate, to some extent, is always changing. It's never static.
Nice try, Marco Rubio. I'm back with Bob Herbert, Christina Bellantoni, and Richard Kim. And the reason I want to play that, so Rubio, again, he stepped in it on the John Carl interview. I think he didn't think it was going to become a headline. I mean, you can see his passive-aggressive note about headlines notwithstanding. And then today he tried to walk it back in a totally incoherent way. But the fascinating aspect of this to me is that it looked to me for the first time in a long time that denialism was looking like a thing that was a disqualifier, or at least something to be defensive about in a way I haven't seen in a while.
And I think nowadays it is. I mean, this is an issue that's, I mean, we're all threatened by this. I mean, the planet is in danger. Something needs to be done. And I think if you're just going to deny that this is even occurring, it means that you're going to be blocking the policies that we need, and it should be a disqualifier.
And the key here to me is the conspiratorial thinking it requires to think that thousands of scientists across the globe are engaged in this massive hoax, which is basically what James Inhofe, who's a sitting U.S. senator, believes, right? The conspiratorial thinking that it takes to believe that is really cuckoo. I mean, that is really out there.
Okay, I mean, I can't believe I'm going to take the other side on this. I mean, so, you know, obviously I don't believe, you know, these views, and I think they're sort of lunatic and really dangerous. On the other hand, large percentages of the American population believe that, and don't they sort of have representation in that political process? And I also worry that, if you have this kind of like circle of disqualified opinions and you keep growing that circle, what that rewards is an incentive structure that depends on sort of an absolute certainty of emotion, like a really kind of intense belief. And, to keep feeding that, if the facts on the ground don't match, you invent a set of facts. And I think, actually, that is what has happened to the Republican Party. They've sort of produced this outrage machine.
So you're just saying, like, against litmus tests as a broad
I say let the democratic process play out, and people should vote these things down.
On climate as a specific thing, the candidate that appeals to the business community tends to be the candidate that'll either win the nomination or win the general election, right? And so this is an area where you
in the Republican Party particularly.
In general, though, you have to be palpable to them to sit in the White House. And so with the business community shifting on this issue or on minimum wage issues or on some other labor issues, right? That's where you start to see the shifts. That guides the politician.
But what you're identifying, though, is precisely the nefarious ideological undercurrent of discussions about what's disqualifying, right? Because, that goes hand in glove with what Richard's saying. You're saying the people that actually draw the lines around what's disqualifying is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And, frankly, that's what's going to decide if you're,
and just
wacko.
watch with immigration reform. The conversation has completely changed since 2005, 2006. When George Bush, people were angry at him in a certain segment of the population because he supported immigration reform. And now it is sort of a moderate Republican.
Well, or on marriage equality. That is a place where you really do see, I've never seen an issue go so quickly from a contentious, contested issue that's at the center of our political debates to one in which opposition to it is quickly becoming taboo.
Well, the truth is that you can only do this as a hypothetical exercise, and that's a good example of why. There was a time when no one could get elected if they were in favor of gay marriage. Now, in many elections, it's a disqualifier if you're opposed to gay marriage. So.
But that makes me hopeful about the power of this kind of, the force of this, right? As opposed to this being something that constrains consensus. It actually is this tool, right? It's a tool of progress when we say that certain things, like opposing marriage equality, are sort of not the kinds of things that mainstream American politicians can advocate.
But it's also a double-edged sword, right? So things like supporting a 90% tax rate, which was once policy in the United States,
that's a very good point.
Would be a completely disqualifying, characteristic for many people in this country.
Yes, if you came forward and said, I am for a 90% top marginal tax rate, which of course was what it was after World War II and the Eisenhower administration before the first round of tax cuts, that would be equivalent, right? Bob Herbert of Demos, Christina Bellantoni of Roll Call, and Richard Kim of TheNation.com. None of you are disqualified in my eyes. That is all in for this evening. The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening, Chris. Thank you. That was awesome.
Thanks.